The house was awake before the sun. The automatic lights turned on one after another, as if an invisible presence was passing through the hallways. But there were no footsteps, no voices, no life, just the distant sound of rain tapping against the glass. Light, constant, and the air conditioning blowing a chill too elegant to be human. Richard Avery opened his eyes slowly. Not because he was well rested, but because there was no reason to sleep longer. The white ceiling above him was immaculate, without cracks, without marks, just like every other day since the accident. He blinked once, then again. He felt the weight of his body and the absence of it below the waist. Nothing. No tingling, no discomfort, no pain, just emptiness. Richard took a deep breath through his nose. The smell was neutral, clean, almost clinical. That house smelled of well-spent money, not of people living inside it. "Another day," he murmured, without moving his lips. The clock read 5:12 a.m. Once, this hour meant airport, meetings, phone calls, crossing time zones. Now it simply meant being awake while the rest of the world still slept and being able to hear the cruel clarity of silence. The Italian wheelchair rested beside the bed, aligned with millimeter precision. It shone discreetly under the indirect light. It cost more than the first apartment he bought when he was in his 20s. A throne too expensive for someone who felt like a king of nothing. Richard transferred his body to the chair with a mechanical movement, forced, repeated hundreds of times. No emotion, no hurry. The loudest sound in the room was the soft click of the seatbelt. He hated that sound. He glided down the wide corridor of the mansion in Beverly Hills. The walls displayed contemporary art, chosen by curators, not by affection. Everything there had value, but nothing had history. As he passed the living room, his eyes landed for a second on the large glass door leading to the garden. On the other side, the perfectly manicured grass still glistened wet from the morning rain. Before the accident, he used to cross that space barefoot, feeling the cold earth beneath his feet. Now he couldn't even feel his own feet. Richard looked away. The kitchen appeared spacious, silent, illuminated by a bluish light coming through the tall windows. Italian marble, stainless steel appliances, everything. Immaculate, nothing out of place. He went to the water filter. He needed something simple, something mundane. A glass of water stretched his arm. The glass was on the top shelf. Richard calculated the distance with his eyes, adjusted the position of the chair, stretched his arm once more. The tips of his fingers almost touched the glass. Almost. The glass remained there, unmoving. He tried again, then once more. On the third attempt, his arm trembled. Not from physical effort, but from something deeper, something that rose from his chest to his throat without asking for permission. Richard stopped. He stayed there with his hands suspended in the air, staring at that simple object, as if it were a personal affront, a glass, a damn glass. It was then that the sound came, a short, involuntary sob. Richard lowered his arm slowly. His body began to give in, not all at once, but in layers. First pride, then anger, finally the accumulated sadness of 2 whole years. He cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. He cried in silence, like someone who learned early on that weakness should not make noise. The tears streamed down his face without him wiping them. Away! They fell onto his expensive shirt, staining the fabric with marks that would disappear in the next wash, unlike him. "Pathetic," he whispered to himself with a broken voice. It was then that he heard it. "You are sad because you cannot walk." The phrase did not come as a question. It came as a statement. Richard turned abruptly, his heart racing. In the kitchen doorway, standing as if she had always been there, was the girl, Anna Claire, small, thin in a simple dress, her feet together, her hands holding a sketchbook against her chest. She did not seem frightened, nor overly curious. Her big eyes were fixed on him with a serene attention, almost too mature for an 8-year-old. "Who let you in here?" Richard growled, hurriedly wiping his face, irritated at being seen like that. Anna Claire did not move. "My mom is cleaning the living room," she said softly. "I was drawing." Silence. Richard felt his face burn, not from the response, but from the truth that the girl had stated bluntly. No one ever talked about it. The impossibility, the loss. It was as if the subject had been banned from the house along with any human sound. "This is not your business," he said dryly. "Go play somewhere else." Anna Claire tilted her head slightly, took 2 steps forward. "Crying is good," she said, "but praying is better." Richard let out a short, bitter laugh. "Pray," he repeated. "For whom exactly?" She shrugged simply. "For God." "There is no one listening." He shot back, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Wake up to life, girl." Anna Claire did not respond immediately. She moved a little closer. Now she was beside the wheelchair. Richard noticed that she was not looking at his legs. She was looking at his face. "Can I pray with you?" The question hung heavily in the air, not as a childish request, but as something that demanded an answer. Richard opened his mouth to laugh again, to humiliate her, to tell her to leave. But he did none of that for some reason he could not explain. He just took a deep breath. "And what would that change?" he asked in a lower tone. "It changes everything." She replied, "Because I won't pray for you as if you were a problem. I will pray with you as 2 friends asking for help together." Richard fell silent. No doctor, no therapist, none of the well-paid people who had passed through that house in 2 years had ever spoken to him that way. He closed his eyes. In an instant, he felt the weight of his own body in the chair, the cold of the floor beneath the wheels, the silence around him. "Do whatever you want," he finally said, exhausted. "But don't expect miracles." Anna Claire nodded. She knelt right there on the cold kitchen floor. She clasped her hands carefully, as if holding something fragile. Richard observed that simple gesture, almost forgotten in his world. On the other side of the house, Mary Dorsey walked down the hallway with a cloth in her hands. As she approached the kitchen, she felt a strange chill. Something in the air seemed different. She stopped at the door and stood still. She saw her daughter kneeling, saw her boss in silence, his eyes downcast. She saw something that didn't fit in that soundless house. On the marble countertop, a forgotten white napkin from breakfast slowly absorbed a drop of water that dripped from the shelf above. Drip, drip. Each drop echoed in the silence. Like a warning, something had begun there. Richard didn't believe that moment would last more than a few seconds. In his mind, it would be just that, a child kneeling. A few beautiful words and then silence would return to fill the house as always. But silence did not return. Anna Claire began to pray softly, almost a whisper. There was no rush, no rehearsal. Each word seemed to come from the same place where the questions no one teaches a child to ask are born. "God," she said simply, "we are here." Richard kept his eyes open at first. He observed the cold, perfectly clean marble floor. He thought about how much that flooring had cost. He thought about how many people had passed through there without ever leaving a mark. He thought about how everything in that house seemed made to not hold traces of anyone. The girl continued. She didn't ask him to walk. She didn't ask him to feel his legs. She didn't ask for anything that sounded too grand. She asked for peace. She asked for courage. She asked that he not feel alone when he woke up in the middle of the night. The word alone pierced Richard like something physical. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, trying not to succumb to that strange discomfort growing in his chest. Faith had always been a distant idea for him, almost offensive, something used by those who needed to believe because they had no alternative. There, kneeling on the floor, that child didn't seem to need anything. She spoke as if conversing with someone she knew well. Richard closed his eyes without realizing when it happened. It was then that he felt it. It wasn't a shock. It wasn't a cinematic miracle. It was something so small that it almost went unnoticed. A warmth began at his feet, slowly rising, as if someone had lit a faint flame beneath a part of his body he had already given up for dead. A light tingling, confusing, hard to explain. Richard held his breath, tried to move, nothing, but the warmth remained. His heart raced, not with joy, but with fear. Fear of raising expectations, fear of imagining things, fear of feeling something and losing it again. Anna Claire continued praying, oblivious to the storm beginning within him. Her small hands were clasped tightly, her face calm, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. It was at that moment that Mary Dorsey entered the kitchen. She came in a hurry, with the cloth still in her hand, ready to call her daughter's attention for being in the way, but stopped at the threshold. The scene hit her all at once. Her daughter kneeling on the cold floor, her boss motionless, eyes closed, a different silence in the air, not heavy, but alive. "Anna Claire," she murmured, alarmed. "What are you doing?" The girl did not respond. She continued praying. Mary felt the impulse to run, to pull her daughter by the arm, to apologize. That was the most powerful man she had ever known. A man who did not like surprises, a man who could fire her without a second thought, but something made her stay. She looked at Richard's face. His eyes were filled with tears, not of anger, not of humiliation, but of something Mary recognized immediately. Deep exhaustion. Without saying a word, she dropped the cloth on the countertop, took a few steps, and knelt beside her daughter. Richard felt her presence without opening his eyes. He felt the weight of that gesture. Two people kneeling for him, not for money, not out of obligation. When the prayer ended, no one spoke for a few seconds. The world seemed to have shrunk in size, concentrated in that small space of the kitchen. Anna Claire stood up first, looked at Richard and smiled, a light smile without expectation. "Done," she said. Richard opened his eyes. His legs remained immobile, but his chest felt different. "Did you feel anything?" Mary asked carefully. Richard swallowed hard. He nodded once. "I can't explain it. That night he didn't sleep. He kept testing his toes. He focused on them as if trying to hear a very distant sound. Sometimes he thought he felt something. Sometimes he was sure he didn't. The doubt kept him awake until dawn. The next day, he called Mary to the office. "I want your daughter to come here every day," he said directly. Mary frowned. "Mr. Richard, she has school. I pay for a better private school, and I'll double your salary." Mary took a deep breath. Something about that request bothered her. "You don't believe in prayer," she said honestly. Richard did not deny. "It I know, but I felt something and I need to understand." Mary hesitated, looked at Anna Claire, who was listening in silence. "Only if you want to, dear," she said. Finally, Anna Claire stepped forward. "I accept," she said, "but with one condition." Richard raised his eyebrows. "What?" "I won't pray for you to walk again." She spoke fearlessly. "I will pray for you to be happy. If God wants to heal, he will heal." But that's not magic. The words fell heavily. Richard realized for the first time that he was facing something profound. He couldn't buy something that didn't obey the rules he had mastered his whole life. He agreed. Days passed. Anna Claire came home after school. Richard waited for her with a prepared table, fresh juice, expensive cookies, and fruits he personally selected. She always thanked him with the same simplicity. Then they would sit on the floor, or rather, he would stay in the wheelchair. She would kneel, and they would pray. Gradually, something changed. Not just in her legs. Richard began to laugh more, tell old stories, ask questions, and listen to answers. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" he asked one afternoon. Anna Claire thought for a moment. I want to have a big house, she said. Not for me, but for children who have nowhere to live. Richard fell silent. He felt something tighten in his chest. Why? He asked. She shrugged. Because no one should feel alone. Mary watched from the door with pride and a fear she couldn't explain. Richard looked at his own hands. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't think of them as useless. That night before sleeping, he placed his feet on the floor beside the bed. He felt nothing, but he didn't give up. He stayed there for a few seconds in silence, and as he lay down, he noticed something strange. For the first time since the accident, he didn't feel on his knees because he was broken. He felt on his knees because he was beginning to learn. Days passed without Richard realizing exactly when the house began to change. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't noisy, it was like dawn. When you notice it, it has already happened. Anna Claire always arrived at the same time. Backpack on her back, light steps down the hallway. Richard began to recognize them, even before seeing her. The small sound of sneakers on the wooden floor became a silent warning that the day could still get better. She would sit on the floor, take out her notebooks, and draw while he worked on his laptop. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was comfortable. Then came the prayers. Nothing changed spectacularly. He still couldn't walk. He still depended on the wheelchair. He still woke up some early mornings with the bitter sensation of loss, but something inside him was less hard, less guarded. Richard began to laugh at silly things, comment on the news, ask about school, listen genuinely, and without realizing it, he started to look forward to those moments like someone waiting for air. It was on one of those afternoons that Anna Claire spoke of her dream. One day I want to have a big house, she said, while coloring a crooked drawing of windows and trees. Do you already live in a big house? Richard replied, smiling slightly. She shook her head. Not for me. For children who don't have a home, children who sleep in fear. Richard fell silent. The word fear echoed inside him more than any medical diagnosis. Mary watched from the door, pride swelling her chest and a strange discomfort, hard to name. Something about that closeness felt too big, too exposed. She was right to feel uneasy. Helena Avery hadn't stepped into that house for months. She lived in Los Angeles, in an apartment facing the ocean, surrounded by parties, convenient friends, and well-paid silences. Her marriage to Richard existed only on paper, a valuable paper enough to secure half of everything. When Helena heard from others that her husband was obsessed with a religious child, she first laughed, then became serious. He has gone mad, she said on the phone, her voice cold. Or someone has driven him mad. Eduardo, Richard's younger brother, listened in silence. He managed part of the family's business. He knew exactly how much money passed through his hands unnoticed. He also knew that time was on his side. If he starts making impulsive decisions, Eduardo murmured, can we stop him? Helena didn't hesitate. Let's request a guardianship, claim mental incapacity, induced religious fanaticism. It was an ugly phrase, spoken with too much ease. A few days later, the first news vans began to appear at the mansion's door. Richard sensed the change in the air before understanding the reason. The once silent garden became invaded by voices, flashes, and questions thrown to the wind. Mr. Avery, is it true that a child is healing you? Do you believe in miracles? Richard slammed the window shut, but Anna Claire didn't have the same protection. One day, as she left school, she was surrounded by microphones, low cameras almost at her face level, quick, sharp questions. Did you say you can heal people? Is your mother being paid for this? Are you deceiving the millionaire? Anna Claire tried to respond, tried to smile, tried to be polite, but she was just a child. She cried. Mary rushed in, pushing journalists away, hugging her daughter tightly, her heart racing. She shouted, demanded respect, asked them to leave. The damage was already done. That night, Anna Claire didn't want to pray. She sat in silence, curled up on the couch, staring into nothing. Richard tried to speak, but couldn't find the words. For the first time, he felt that his presence had put that girl in danger. 2 days later, Mary fainted at work. It was quick. One moment she was cleaning the room, the next she was on the floor. The dry sound of her body hitting the ground echoed through the house like a gunshot. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and urgency. Too much white light. Mary was pale, weak. The tests came in sequence. The doctors exchanged glances before speaking. Advanced illness, few options, no promise. Anna Claire listened silently until she couldn't anymore. She sat by her mother's bed and cried like never before, a loud, uncontrolled cry, without faith, without structure, just fear. "Mummy, don't. Leave me," she repeated with a broken voice. Mary held her daughter's hand with difficulty. "You always taught me to have faith," she whispered. Now it's you who needs to have it." But Anna Claire didn't seem strong that night. She seemed small, lost. Richard arrived an hour later, still in the wheelchair, convincing the driver to take him despite the difficulties. When he entered the room and saw a girl crying, felt something tighten in her chest violently. He approached slowly, touching Mary's other hand. For the first time he asked for nothing, negotiated nothing, expected no. Return, and closed his eyes. "If I have to lose," he murmured, "teach me to lose without anger." They stayed like that, 3 hands united, no explanation. 3 days later, the doctors repeated the tests and were baffled. The tumor had drastically receded. The numbers made no sense. The evolution was improbable, rare. "Spontaneous remission," they said cautiously. The press called it a miracle. Richard called it nothing, just breathed. That night back at home, he entered the kitchen alone. The same kitchen, the same countertop, the same silence. On the marble, a glass of water was out of place. Not perfectly aligned, just there, simple. Richard reached out. This time he didn't try to grab it. He smiled tiredly because for the first time he understood. Faith hadn't been tested to prove strength. It had been tested to break what still needed to fall. No one in the house celebrated loudly when Mary was discharged from the hospital. He heard no shouts, no exaggerated hugs, just a different silence, no longer empty but attentive, as if everyone had learned to listen better. Mary returned thinner, slower, but alive. The afternoon sun streamed through the bedroom window when she sat. On the bed for the first time at home, Anna Claire stayed by her side the whole time, holding her mother's hand as if the world could slip through her fingers if she let go. Richard watched from the door. There were no words that fit there, no explanation, no speech. He simply felt her once, like someone recognizing something they cannot control, and for the first time he didn't try. The following days brought no miracles, no spectacular events. They brought routine, physical therapy at 7, slow stretches, breathing, controlled pain, fatigue. Richard began to respect his own time. He had previously hated slowness. Now he was learning to coexist with it. Every minimal movement was treated with patience, not with desperate hope. Carefully, Anna Claire continued going to the house, not just to pray anymore. Sometimes she sat next to him in the garden. They talked a little. They watched the leaves move with the wind, the distant sound of the city. "Do you still want to walk?" she asked one time without looking at him. Richard thought before replying. "I do," he said, "but not like before." She smiled slightly, satisfied with something only she seemed to understand. The first moment happened 6 months later. Nothing dramatic, no music, no audience. The physical therapist asked him to support himself on the parallel bars. Richard held on tightly, felt the sweat trickle down his back, his arms trembling more than his legs. "When you're ready," she said. He took a deep breath and stood for just a few seconds, with support, with fear, but standing. The ground felt distant, the body strange. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, not to give thanks, but to avoid falling. When he sat down again, he didn't cry, he just laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh, like someone finding something they had lost, unsure if they still remembered how to use it. A year later, the walker came. 2 years later, the first steps alone. The doctors spoke of atypical neural recovery, improbable regeneration, rare statistics. Richard listened to everything attentively, but without the need to agree or disagree. He knew what had changed. It wasn't when he felt his legs. It was when he stopped demanding that they respond. Meanwhile, the other battle was happening outside the house. Helen and her team advanced with the request for interdiction. They claimed Richard was being manipulated, emotionally unstable, incapable of making rational decisions. They used old reports, photos, distorted clippings. Richard responded in silence. He gathered documents, transfers, contracts, numbers that spoke for themselves. Edward couldn't explain, not this time. The trial was quick, cold, technical. Edward was removed, then arrested. Helen lost the divorce case, leaving the courtroom without looking back, her heels echoing in the corridor like a sound that no longer held power over him. Richard left the courthouse in the late afternoon. The sky was clear. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to run home. A few weeks later, he called Mary and Anna Claire to talk. They sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen, the same marble, but now there were signs of use, cups out of place, a cloth forgotten on the chair. "Anna," he began, "you told me one day that you wanted a big house for children without homes." She felt shy. "I thought about that for a long time," he continued, "and I decided it won't be just one house." She frowned. "There will be many." Mary brought her hand to her mouth. "No houses," Richard said calmly, "in various cities, with schools, with food, with psychologists, with space for anyone who wants to pray, and for those who don't want to as well." Anna Claire's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "I am," he replied, "but only if you promise one thing." "What?" "That when you grow up, you'll help me take care of them." She didn't respond with words, just walked over to him and hugged him as she did when she was younger. A tight, genuine hug. The Together We Walk Foundation was inaugurated in silence, without grand speeches, without names on golden plaques. The first shelter received 50 children, then others came gradually, one at a time. Anna Claire grew up there, studied, learned, fell, got back up, graduated in social work. One day she sat at the same kitchen table, now an adult, to sign the documents that made her the director of the foundation. Mary continued working, not as an employee, but as a coordinator, by choice, by dignity. Richard began to travel, visiting the shelters, sitting on the floor with the children, listening to stories, sometimes praying, sometimes just being silent. On a clear afternoon in Beverly Hills, he was in the garden walking, slowly, unsupported. Anna Claire walked beside him. "Do you know what the greatest miracle of my life was?" he asked. She thought for a second. "To walk again." Richard shook his head, smiling. "No." He stopped, looking at the house behind them. He was learning to feel again. Anna Claire held his hand as she used to when she was little. "And my greatest miracle," she said with a steady voice, "wasn't gaining a father." Richard looked at her, confused. "It was saving my mother." He closed his eyes. Tears came without weight, without shame. In front of them, the glass door of the house was open. The afternoon breeze entered, gently moving the curtains. Richard took another step and crossed over. "Yeah,